With Legos, you don't go and cut the Lego in half because it sort of doesn't suit you. You figure out how with these building blocks to build the thing that you're trying to build anyway. And we want to do the same thing. So what's the first step? It's to do a visual inventory. Really, really hard to do. Mainly, I think, because people have a really hard time looking at their own code from a step back, looking at their own site and not seeing it as all the history and the ways this developed and that developed. So I'll show you a little bit of how I did it at Facebook. I took big, giant screenshots of all the main pages in the site, the main user flows, the 10, 15, 20 major pages that were getting most of the page views. And I did a lot of copying. I copied all the headings out of those pages and into one single document. I copied all the lists out and into one single document, all the tabs, and so forth. Basically doing all the very basic objects and getting them all out next to each other. And the first thing I did is I showed it to the designers and I said, you have all these different font sizes, and their first reaction was, oh, we aren't even supposed to have this font size, and this font size. Immediate simplification. It was great. Then we had to look more into how to simplify the code. So it's kind of all about pattern matching, but with a slightly removed look at your own site. So it could be great even to try and get somebody to do this for you who hasn't been looking at the site for years or months. I think it's just super hard when you build something, you feel sort of attached to the different parts of it to kind of separate yourself and just look at it as simple visual patterns. One important thing, PHP objects are not equal to CSS objects. CSS objects are generally going to be much, much, much more granular than PHP objects. Especially if you're from an engineering background, you're going to be so tempted to make one PHP object equal to one CSS object. Don't do it. Don't do it. Resist the temptation. JavaScript objects, there's going to be a lot of connection, but they're not going to be exactly the same. We're really in the CSS layer of the stack, looking to just define our visual patterns, and that's it. If two things are exactly the same visually, I don't care that the PHP layer is pulling data from a friend feed one time and an ad another time. To me, they're exactly the same thing. But a warning, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I had a moment of panic that Tom helped me through at Facebook where I realized I had to make their CSS bigger before I could make it smaller. When you start building out these components, you're actually going to be adding to the size of your files. It's really hard to do that when the whole goal is, especially the company that's decided to be really motivated about improving performance, is to make everything smaller. You have to go through a stage where you make it worse before you make it better. You have to add in all these little components before you're going to be able to take out all the cruft and the duplication that is currently in place. Also, sorry, one more note to myself on my slide. Before you start changing the templates, make all your basic objects. It's really important not to confuse these two steps. I think we've too closely linked the creation of templates and the creation of actual HTML pages with the creation of our CSS objects. We need to kind of decouple that, make all the objects, and then once that's done, or at least stabilized, we make all the changes to the template to include those objects. Okay, so stale rules. I mean, this is an obvious one. CSS gets crufty. Stuff gets left over that isn't intended to stay in the files, things that aren't used anymore. One important thing to note is that stale actually means two different things. There's truly stale, which is a rule which is absolutely not being used in your site anymore and just needs to be deleted, but hasn't been. There's another kind of stale, which is rules that are used on subsequent pages, or they're used after a user clicks. For example, on the Facebook website, a user would click on, I think, a video, and it would pop up the video in a little popover thing. And that popover thing had, rounded gray border. And so those styles, if you test for, like with Dust Me selectors, are going to look like crufty, unused styles. They're actually not, because you have to have that user click before those styles get exposed. So you can't just it's hard to do it in a super automated way. So you have to figure out what kind of stale selectors you have. You can try Dusmy selectors. It's really important to use it on both a single page and site-wide. Both numbers are going to tell you something about what's going on in your site. You also want to track it over time. I could try to give you an absolute number and say you should have only 20% stale selectors, but that's kind of silly. You have to figure out how many stale selectors you have, and then decide how to respond to changes in that number. That's much more useful. You also want to keep your landing page as light as possible. So if you do have a bunch of selectors that aren't used until subsequent pages, it may make more sense to have a really light, super fast landing page, and then have, you pull in after the onload event, the extra rules that the user is going to see. If 60% of your users go from page 1 to page 2, they're going to get to page 2, but it might make it worth it all the same to have page 1 be as fast as possible so they get that initial good impression. The third component is unpredictability. We want to make each object predictable as possible and location independent. I'm going to give you a little example of this one. It's headings. They basically need to be little reusable Legos that you can grab and put anywhere in your page. You don't ever want to have to recode them. So in an ideal world, you would have a list of 6 headings, and you'd know exactly which one was most important and which one was least important, and you code it that way, and it'd be perfect. In reality, especially when you get called in to deal with serious CSS kudzu, you have to go and first sort of find all the headings and pull them all in together. You don't know what order which is more important. There may be one which is 13 pixels in bold and one which is 14 pixels in normal, and you're not sure how you rank them and how you build them. So an important step is actually just finding all the headings and doing that sort of detective work. But then when we start building out these new components, we need to absolutely avoid location-dependent styles. Does anybody know what I mean by that? A little bit? Okay. So imagine you had a function area, and that function was basically going to return the area of a sphere. Sounds pretty basic. But imagine if every now and then, instead it just randomly kind of returned the diameter just for fun. If your JavaScript was doing that, what would you do? Broken, right? Like that's basically completely broken. And yet in CSS, we accept that that's the normal way that things work. But it's broken. A giant pink heading shouldn't become a tiny blue heading just because you paste it somewhere else in the page. That isn't predictable. As soon as you do that, there's nothing that can happen to your CSS except kudzu. It's like a sure path to sort of disastrously big and massive CSS. So let's look at an example. I have the weather module H3, the color's red, and then the tabs module H3 and the color's blue. First of all, the global color isn't even defined. So what's going to happen if we're not in either of those examples? Right? If we're not in a tabs module or weather module. No style, default style, who knows, right? Also, what happens if we want to be able to have a weather module red H3 in the tabs module? You can't do it. You've made them so that they're incompatible. They can't be used in the same location, and there's no default. So you're setting yourself up to write rules that overwrite rules that overwrite rules to end up with something that gives you the colors that you wanted in a particular location. Facebook did this. For example, they didn't have any default settings for their text size. So the default text on the Facebook website is 11 pixels, and it's 333 gray. But they didn't have a default set. So what happened is they ended up with 458 declarations of their default gray. They ended up with 656 declarations of 11 pixels. So this is the kind of stuff that we started to sort of unravel what exactly had happened with the CSS styles. Basically, for every little chunk of the page, things were getting rewritten and rewritten and rewritten because the good defaults hadn't been put into place. So how do you know if you have that problem?